Good morning, boys and girls. We're going to continue our read aloud. This is called Cash Crops, the Carolinas, and Slavery. It's lesson 4 from our Colonial America, Domain 10, Read Aloud Anthology, the Listening and Learning. Let's review just a little bit about what we know so far. We'll do that by some questions and answers. What are the 2 settlements that you have heard of so far? The Lost Colony at Roanoke Island and Jamestown Colony. Who was the English colonist largely responsible for the survival of the colonists when they first arrived at Jamestown? John Smith. With which Native American group did the settlers at Jamestown interact? The Powhatan. According to one version, which Powhatan pleaded with her father, Chief Powhatan, to spare John Smith's life. Pocahontas, also known as Matoaka and later known as Rebecca. What types of challenges did the colonists at Jamestown face? Illness, a different climate than England, brackish or salty water, lack of food and supplies, fires, lack of organization, tension with the Native Americans, and so forth and so on. In the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colonists ran out of food and many died. What is this time called? The starving time. Just when the Jamestown colonists thought all was lost, another man from England came to their rescue with 3 ships filled with supplies. Who was that man? Lord de la Warr. What crop did the colonists at Jamestown start growing that saved their colony? Tobacco. And who helped guide and lead the growing of this crop? The Powhatan and John Rolfe. So let's begin our story for today. As you heard, John Rolfe was well known for marrying Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, also known as Matoaka, and for making Jamestown, and therefore Virginia, an important economic center. John Rolfe did this by growing and exporting tobacco and then shipping it out of the area to places that wanted to buy it. You might be thinking, yuck, tobacco means smoking, and we all know that is a very unhealthy habit. Even land-greedy King James thought it so. He once said that smoking is a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. However, because many people still wanted tobacco and were willing to pay for it, tobacco became a huge part of the southern colonies' economy. The Spanish were the first to bring tobacco to Europe from the Americas. They had discovered that Native Americans in various parts of Central and South America used tobacco in a variety of ways. It was chewed, smoked, used as medicine, and was an important part of many religious ceremonies. In fact, when Christopher Columbus set foot in the New World, he was greeted by local natives carrying gifts of fruit, spears, and dried leaves that had a strong fragrance. Those leaves were tobacco. When the English arrived in North America, they too found that many Native Americans grew and used tobacco. The English settlers' get-rich plan had not succeeded when they failed to find gold. Some settlers had also experimented with growing crops such as rice and grapes, but they too were unsuccessful. However, John Rolfe, with the guidance of the Powhatan, made a pivotal contribution to the doomed Jamestown economy. Wealthy Europeans were beginning to develop a taste for tobacco. However, much of the tobacco was being shipped back to Europe and it had a bitter taste. John Rolfe introduced a new tobacco plant to the fields around Jamestown. He brought in a less bitter-tasting plant from the West Indies. Well, actually, he brought in the seeds to see if they would grow. It was an experiment, but it worked. The new tobacco plants grew and flourished in the red Virginia soil, and so this milder tasting Virginia tobacco became much sought after. Its increased use among the growing number of English smokers transformed the colony's economy. Jamestown became a place of wealth and enterprise. Shiploads of Englishmen and women eagerly set off to make their fortunes there. The gold that the early settlers had sought turned out to be in the form of an odorous plant. Many people became wealthy as a result of growing this cash crop. No doubt, if you had been there in Jamestown, you might have heard the sound of gold coins jingling in the colonists' pockets. Tobacco was so popular that in 1619 it had become Virginia's main crop. Within 50 years, the colony exported about 15 million pounds of it to Europe. Eventually, tobacco was such a widespread cash crop that the governor had to remind the settlers to grow food as well. With the success of the tobacco industry, the future of Jamestown was finally secured. However, there was one major drawback to growing tobacco. Back then, a lot of people were needed who were willing to work very, very hard to tend the large plantations. And people like that weren't easy to find. In the beginning, the new tobacco farms were mostly indentured servants working for them. Indentured servants were people who had agreed to travel to Virginia and eventually to other parts of North America to work for a period of time for a specific person. The agreed upon period of time was usually 7 years. Often these indentured servants were poor people from England or from other parts of Europe whose ship passage was purchased for them by their employer. Then, as soon as they arrived at their new homes, the indentured servants were put to work. These indentured servants labored long and hard in the tobacco fields. After the agreed-upon time of service was up, and if they were still alive after the many hardships they had endured, they were free to venture out on their own. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived in Jamestown with what is believed to have been the first 20 Africans brought to North America. According to some historical accounts, these Africans were brought to North America as indentured servants, and they may have worked alongside white indentured servants. However, as the colony developed and there became a serious shortage of workers, colonists believed that the use of slavery was the most efficient way to manage plantations. Before long, thousands of Africans were brought to the colonies against their will and forced to work. Why did this terrible transition take place? Remember, the English had begun to lay claim to large areas of North America. After all, the Spanish were claiming most of Central and South America and even parts of Southern North America as their own. And the French had claimed much of the northern North America. The English thought it was only fair that they claim huge chunks of land too. As you recall, England's very first attempt to colonize North America on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina, failed and became known as the Lost Colony. But in 1663, Charles II, son of Charles I and grandson of King James I, decided to try again near the same area. Charles II eagerly gave a charter or official document to 8 of his friends that stated that the land between Virginia and the Spanish colony of Florida now belonged to him, well, to England, to be precise. Today, this land is North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, although Georgia was not officially colonized until much later. Charles II also named part of his land after himself. This charter was extended to 1665, and more land was divided up among his friends to manage. Charles II was particularly generous to those who had helped his family when his father, Charles I, was killed. At that time, Charles II had been forced to flee to another country. And when Charles II was eventually allowed to return to England and take the throne, he owed a great deal of money to a great many people. His way out of debt was to give them North America. Well, parts of it anyway. Having heard how successful Jamestown was, hundreds of them, and then thousands of them, of the English flocked to the South, and to the Carolinas in particular. In 1670, a busy seaport was established called Charlestown. I'm sure you can guess who Charlestown was named after. In the beginning, many colonists in the Carolinas established small farms. Before long, large plantations replaced small farms for the purpose of growing cash crops. The top 3 cash crops in this area during this time were rice, tobacco, and indigo. Indigo is a plant used to make a beautiful blue dye, and it was brought to South Carolina from the West Indies by a young woman named Eliza Lucas Pinckney. Similar to how John Rolfe experimented with types of tobacco seeds, Pinckney experimented with types of indigo until she was able to make a superior, valuable dye. The warm climate and marshy stretches of land with fewer trees in the Carolinas were perfect for growing rice and indigo, whereas tobacco thrived in certain parts of North Carolina. With drier land and more trees, and geography and climate of Virginia was not conducive to growing rice and indigo, tobacco was the only cash crop in Jamestown. As in Virginia, it soon became clear that there was a lot of money to be made in the Carolinas by growing crops. Many more workers were needed. Unfortunately, the solution the colonists chose was the extensive use of slavery. As you can imagine, no one volunteers to be enslaved. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans did not come to North America of their own free will as part of an exchange agreement, nor did they have any hope of ever being set free. Instead, they were taken by force. The roots of slavery go deep into the past. Throughout history, powerful people have enslaved less powerful people. Although England began trading enslaved Africans later than some other European countries, it soon became one of the biggest slave trading countries due to the widespread use of slavery in the English colonies. For England, the African slave trade was part of a larger trading network from Europe, West Africa, and North America, including the colonies in the West Indies. Some of these trade routes became known as triangular trade routes. If you look at the map, you will see why. Through these triangular trade networks, certain goods were traded for much needed items. Enslaved Africans were just part of the network, too. English ships laden with iron products, especially guns, arrived in the West African ports to trade their goods for slaves and gold. Africans who became enslaved had previously lived freely in Africa but became victims of kidnapping by slave raiders. Many of these raiders were Africans themselves, armed with guns supplied by European slave traders. Enslaved Africans were considered to be valuable workers. Captured Africans were loaded onto ships destined for parts of North America. This trade route from West Africa to North America became known as the Middle Passage. If the West Indies were their final destination, enslaved Africans were exchanged for goods such as molasses and sugar that were then transported to the southern colonies. Many others stayed on the ship and were taken to the colonies along with the goods. Although there were enslaved Africans in all parts of the 13 English colonies, most enslaved Africans were sent to the South. This was because most farms in the Middle Atlantic and New England regions were smaller and more easily maintained by families. However, some enslaved Africans in the cities worked in houses and shops as servants or as skilled artisans or craftsmen. The business of enslaving and shipping Africans The business of enslaving and shipping captured African men, women, and children was a gruesome or terrible one. Captured Africans were packed like cargo onto ships where there was hardly enough room to move. Many were chained together or to parts of the ship. Very little food or water was provided, and the conditions were extremely unsanitary. There was usually no medical assistance for those who became sick. The journey itself could take 6 to 10 weeks to complete. The Africans had no idea where they were going or if they would survive the journey. Although enslaved Africans were valued for their labor, the traders believed that there was an endless supply of these workers. Therefore, if some died along the way, the traders thought that they could easily be replaced. Many captured Africans died before they even reached the Americas. Those who did survive and reached the shore were marched off the ship in chains to be examined by prospective buyers and then sold at auction. There was very little regard for the humanity of these African men, women, and children. The main objective was to put them to work on plantations to make a lot of money for Europeans.